Hello, and welcome to this April 2nd edition of Stories from Real Life. I'm your host, Melvin E. Edwards, and our show this week is an experiment. Your minds and hearts are our laboratory. The elements we'll be working with are politics, religion, and race. I just hope we can handle that mixture without blowing anything up. My guests today are a couple of my real life friends. Stephen Simpson is a pastor and writer in Alabama, and Rob Ryan is an attorney in Georgia. I'm at my home base in Texas. I'll transcribe this episode in case you don't speak drawl or SEC. Gentlemen, thanks for being here today.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you.
In our episode this week, we have a mini roundtable discussion about some of the most volatile aspects of American life. And I'm going to be an active participant rather than just an interviewer like I normally am. My objective today is to either create a new political path forward or find one we can follow without surrendering our deeply held principles to defend and protect constitutional norms. We are not going to have any purity tests, culture wars, or virtue signaling. But if our virtues are signaled by our lives, I think that's a risk all three of us are willing to take. So in full disclosure, all three of us are former Republicans and are now independents. We're between the ages of 50 and 60, and we've been without a political home for nearly a decade. I'm calling this episode Men of Goodwill because the three of us, along with our Twitter friend, the Values Voter, had Zoom sessions last summer to discuss topics like this, and our group was called Men of Goodwill. I'll start there by asking my questions. So, what do you think it means to be a man of goodwill to each one of you?
Well, for me, it has to do with your heart and your intentions. When I engage with people, I try to engage in good faith. I try not to be a cynic. My problem is my own natural inclination is to be cynical. That happens sometimes when you get older and when you've been burned. But I try to approach people with an open heart. To me, being cynical is lazy. It's easy to be cynical. The challenge for me personally is to do the hard work of hope and to hope for the best when I interact with people or situations, and to do my best. At the end of the day, I believe I have to give an answer or give an account to God for how I think and how I speak, and I fall short every day. But as long as I have that as sort of my true north on my moral compass, if I do go astray, it pulls me back in line.
Okay, Rob,
I'll leave it.
How about you, Rob?
Yeah, well, it's an interesting question. I think the cynicism part that Stephen mentioned is very important. We've got almost an epidemic of extreme cynicism these days, I think, where people don't, it's difficult to engage in good faith conversations because people want to take the worst aspect of everything and everybody and not believe that anything is true or anything can be good. But to be a man of goodwill, I think, first of all, we have to have some integrity, which we're not going to be perfect. We're going to mess up. And so with that integrity, we've got to have some humility also. And then I think there's a concept, and it's a biblical concept of hospitality. And I think in our country today, we can use the concept of hospitality and how we interact with other people. When we come in contact with other people, are we giving them the benefit of the doubt? Are we engaging with them? Are we listening to what they have to say? Or are we just sort of using them? And, we're using them. We're looking at them as not real people, but more as like symbols of whatever position they may have on something. And so to be a person of goodwill, I think we have to approach other people really to treat them the way we want to be treated. It's really what it boils down to. If we come at somebody yelling at them, if we come at somebody telling them how wrong they are, or if we try to use somebody for our purposes. That's not goodwill. If we're afraid to tell somebody the truth because we don't want to upset them, that's also not really goodwill. Sometimes it may be very difficult, and we want to be careful how we do that, but we have to always tell the truth also.
Okay, I completely agree with that. And I would say, adding on to what you two gentlemen have said, for me, I think it's a matter of being honest, sincere, and seeking common ground. We know we may not agree on everything, and sometimes we may not agree on anything. But I think at the very minimum, we need to acknowledge each other's humanity. And I think, as basic as that is, I think that's one of the problems I see in America, that in the world, that we dehumanize each other, and then we can think the worst about somebody we've never even met before. It's absolutely amazing to me that strangers can get into arguments online they've never met before, they've never engaged before, but they automatically think the worst about each other. And I think being a man of goodwill, first of all, means I'm coming forward with an honesty and integrity that says, I hope you can trust me, and then I expect you to do the same. And then we come into it with a little bit of vulnerability. We are hoping for the best, and then if that's not the outcome, then we make adjustments. But instead of going into it with the worst intentions, or believing each other has the worst mindset or the worst intentions, then I think we can have a conversation if we think we are going into it with some kind of goal, positive goal, mutual goal in mind. All right, so let's go to the next question. Do you still think it's still important to engage with political opponents? Either one of you can start first.
All right.
You go ahead, Rob.
Excuse me, y'all. Well, we all come from the Twitter world. I don't know if y'all are on any other social media. I'm not. That's really my only outlet. But that's how we met each other. And there's a certain type of engagement that takes place there, which on occasion can be beneficial. Often it's really not. With your political enemies on Twitter, it's often, quite superficial. I think it's extremely important we keep talking to each other. I don't know if those conversations, for each one of us, how and where do those conversations take place? We have different levels of influence. Melvin, your podcast reaches a certain group. Stephen, through his ministry, reaches a certain group. I come in contact with people. We all have influence within our communities. I think for most of us, particularly for me and Stephen, maybe for you too, Melvin, a lot of our family and friends, closest family and friends, are Trump supporters. And have been for this past, I can't believe, nearly decade. And you can't stop talking to those people, because they're your friends, they're your family, they're the people that are closest to you. How could you stop talking to them? Now, I will say that when all this strange time in American history started, 2015, 2016, I would get into a lot more debates, discussions, different family members, friends, things like that. I backed way off of all that. We don't discuss politics that much in a direct manner at all. But I still think there's ways of interacting. There's ways of trying to influence. You just can't stop talking to each other. Otherwise, we're in a dark place. And that's how I feel.
I agree 100% with Rob. Most of the people in my life would differ with me politically, but I love them. And I think one of the things that helps, particularly when we think about online, so often online interactions center so much on politics. The fact is, there's so many things in life that are more important in our lives, in our relationships, than just to center on politics. There's 1,000 things we can talk about besides politics. And I do believe it's important to engage even on political issues. But I think that there's a way to do that that's principles oriented more than personality oriented. It's okay, and I do regularly, to talk about personalities. But at the end of the day, I try to focus on, in my real world interactions, on principles and the values that I hold dear, and finding common ground. The interesting thing to me is not necessarily who people vote for. That's important. But the bigger question is, why do people vote the way they vote? What are their heart motivations? And oftentimes you find on that level, we may not be as different as we think we are sometimes. And online things get magnified and they become extreme. But I find in real world it's not that way. And like Rob says, I think if we cut people off because they vote differently than we do, especially family and loved ones, I think we're in a very dark place, and it's very unhelpful.
Talking about social media, it's definitely hard to be nuanced with only 280 characters to work with. So you've got to learn how to be concise and to the point. But sometimes the to the point becomes blunt, and the bluntness becomes sort of the igniter. And so I think we have to be very careful. I know I have to be very careful. I work with words, but I'm not perfect by any means. And sometimes I say things, I go back and read something later and I think, I wish I had said this differently, or I wish I'd added this word or that word. It might have taken some of the sting out of it because it didn't come across the way I hoped it would have. And so again, that's comes with the first question about looking at each other as someone of goodwill. Hopefully somebody will see something I've written. If they think it came across a little harsh, hopefully their first thought will be, well, maybe he was rushing or was having a bad day, or not that I'm a bad person. Like, don't think the worst about me or us think the worst about someone else based on one or two quick interactions. Although, to be blunt, there are people who we can think the worst about them with one or two interactions, because some people are just vile. There's no other way to put it. Some people want the controversy. They just don't care. They want that. So, as a follow up to that, at what point do you think we should disengage with someone?
Well, to me, what you said, you can discern oftentimes in a conversation fairly quickly whether someone has goodwill or not. Uh, the other day, someone didn't like something that I said. They didn't like the principle behind it, but what they said to me was based on a picture of me that was on Twitter. They said, "Your nostrils are crooked."
Wow,
I thought,
that's deep
you know, I,
intellectual conversation right there.
I have heard a lot of personal insults, and especially about my appearance, and I can go along with most of them. Um, but that was a new one. That was new. And I thought, this conversation
That guy
is
knows what
probably
he's talking about.
right. Yeah, I could smell him from a long way off. Um, it was clear to me pretty quickly that that was not going to be a profitable conversation. Uh, and of course, there are much more extreme examples. When I see someone who is overtly engaging in racism, misogyny, various forms of bigotry, uh, personal attacks, slander, I I'm not going to engage with them very long, if at all.
Yeah, I think hopefully as time has gone by, those of us that are on social media, I think have started to evolve and learn better how to maybe use it. And so in the earlier days, I was more apt to respond, get into a back and forth with somebody who clearly was not a person of goodwill. Maybe they're using whatever, a racial epithet, and I might get into it with them. I don't really do that anymore. I tend to just block that person. If they're obviously not a person of goodwill, they're not somebody you can engage with, they're not somebody you can have a discussion with, then, it's kind of like throwing pearls before swine. To even engage with them, you're getting down in the mud with them. It's not going to change anybody's mind. It's only going to give them a bigger platform to say what they want to say. And they're trolling often for that kind of interaction. And so, I think social media, and I have two minds about this because we're all on it. We met each other through Twitter. You can become friends with people on social media, but it's had a very detrimental effect in many ways. But I hope maybe we're becoming more sophisticated in how we use it. And it's just not worth engaging with a lot of these people.
I had a situation the other day. It's the first time I've run across something like this. I've had a lot of negative interactions with people, but generally the ones who are negative are the ones who don't follow me or who I don't follow. So if I post something and somebody shares it and then it's a third party who comes into the conversation, those are generally can be the most negative ones. But the other day I had somebody who he was just spoiling for a fight. And I don't know what or why, but he decided to use my avatar picture. He took it and used it as his own and then changed his name to my name. And I tried to report it to the Twitter Department of Investigations or whatever they call it. And I had to show my driver's license and all this other stuff. I'm thinking, I just told you what happened, so why don't you just go investigate it? You can look it up yourself. It's not that hard. And then I won't go into make this too in depth, but the guy and I ended up having sort of an offline conversation, and I said, just take my picture off your avatar. I don't care what you want to call yourself. People know you're not me. Just take my picture off. I'll block you. You block me. We never interact with each other again, and we can go on our merry ways. So hopefully he will keep his end of the bargain. I don't plan to be a troll to follow him to see if he's doing it or not. I'm just having to trust that we can just go on, and I have no reason to interact with him, and hopefully he finds no reason to come back after me. But for our next question, I mentioned at the beginning that we consider ourselves political independents now. Do you think the two-party system is still sustainable?
We've had such a long history in this country of a two-party system. Of course, it was not necessarily that way in the very, very beginning. There was no mention of political parties, for example, in the Constitution, or at the time George Washington was serving as the first president, but it very quickly came into being two parties, and the names of the parties have changed somewhat over time. There was the Whigs, the Democrat and Republicans, whatever, but now we have the Democrats and the Republicans for quite some time. To me, that's not likely to change. It's just too difficult for a third party to gain traction, to gain momentum, to take a place. Now, the one thing that I wonder whether it could change is whether the Trump Republican Party becomes so extreme that it, in essence, becomes the third party, and something else of a more mainstream character does become the second party. And so I don't know. I mean, I know that certainly in this part of the country, There's no indication the Republican Party is going away because they're winning elections. Not everywhere, but they're winning a lot of them. And so I think the two-party system is probably going to persist, maybe with some changes along the way.
It's really a challenge. All three of us are now politically independent, and the independents, the people in the country who identify as independent, that number is growing significantly. In fact, I believe now more people identify as independent than either Republican or Democrat. And yet, at the same time, as Rob said, the two-party system is very entrenched. It's very difficult to have access to ballots. It's very difficult to get on the ballot if you're not part of those two major parties. I think it would be interesting to see whether or not either party, either of the two major parties, is open and embracing to people who are independents, if they are willing to have centrists in their party. Right now, one party in particular is running toward the extreme, and they have made it very, very clear that they do not want anyone centrist. In fact, they don't want anyone who doesn't identify with one personality, with one person. And that to me is not a political party. That's heading toward becoming a cult. And so whether or not that's sustainable, or whether or not the Republican Party ends up splitting into two different parties, I don't know. I know that there are a lot of dissatisfied Republicans, but they feel trapped and they can't bring themselves to vote Democratic Party because of some extremes on that side. So which party is willing to embrace centrists? That to me down the road will be the most viable party. And as Rob said, in our part of the country, in the South and in the Southeast, there's not a lot of competition for the Republican Party right now. It's fairly dominant.
Well, it's going to be interesting to see what happens. I prefer to think the third party could emerge somehow, but I don't know. I don't really know how that would work, because we've got a lot of people who are not part of those two parties, but they're not really a part of any cohesive group. So you got the Green Party, and you got the Constitutional Party, and you got libertarians and people like that, but they don't really agree with each other, and they don't really work together. So I don't know how that's going to work. But I think back to the mid 1850s when we were facing the Civil War in this country, and the Republican Party was essentially the third party. Yes. And the Whigs died off and the Republicans grew from those ashes. So maybe at some point, something like hopefully it won't require something like a civil war to develop those types of systems. But again, money is the engine for politics. And I think that's the real difficulty with creating a third party, the money and the primary system. So you wouldn't ever have, I can't imagine ever having a primary for independents. So I don't know how that would even look. And then you got the money system with their RNC and the DNC, and we could go into that too. But that's a hot button issue right now that I probably don't want to touch. But go ahead, Steve.
Well, I was just going to say, if something does emerge, it will be organic. It will be grassroots. One particular group that I follow, you all may follow, is the Principles First group, led by Heath Mayo and others. And it's very organic. I love the way they approach this. There are former Republicans and former Democrats who are involved. And right now, they're very centered on principles, on basic character and integrity, and finding common ground. Uh, and so something is bubbling up there that's worth watching. And I don't know that they're considering at all becoming a third party, but it may emerge that way as time goes on. We've seen them rapidly grow over the past few years, and they're attracting some really amazing people and some very key leaders. And so I have a lot of optimism. I haven't yet been able to go to one of their summits. I would love to go. I have interacted with quite a few people who are very involved with it. So that may be a type or an example of something that could emerge.
So, Rob, I think you were going to say something.
Yeah, well, I was just going to mention, I think if you think about the two parties now, really the main difference that I see, the Democratic Party has its issues for sure. It has its far left people in the party, but it is not in any way centered around a cult of personality. There's no there's the, there's no cult of personality of Joe Biden, for example. There's just not. You don't see people with Joe Biden has bumper stickers on their truck. Um, the Republican Party more and more is becoming a cult of personality. You mentioned the RNC, Melvin. I was just reading how the RNC is essentially becoming a legal slush fund for payment of Trump's legal bills. We know, I believe in 2020, there was not even a party platform put forth at the Republican Party convention. It's become almost wholly centered around one person. Now, the interesting question to me is, Trump is 77 years old. He's not going to be there forever. What happens when that person is no longer there? Does it revert back to more of a normal political party, or does it then coalesce around some other new personality that arises and continues on down this track that it's on? I just don't know.
And you mentioned, and I think correctly, that Biden, there's not a cult of personality around Biden. But from my perspective, somebody who was sort of an insider in politics for a while, at least in Texas state politics, I have seen that in the Democratic Party and within our political adulthood. I think Bill Clinton had that. I think Barack Obama had that. Not to the rabid degree that Trump currently has it, but the way I've described it is most politicians, especially national politicians, have supporters. Clinton, Obama, and Trump have fans. And I think that's a little bit of a different dynamic that we're not really used to, and we still don't quite know how to address or deal with on a regular basis. So let's get into, since we're talking about some really touchy issues, let's move on to some racial relation issues, and I want to start this one. So my question is: are race relations getting better or worse? And so here's how I would answer the question. I think racial laws are obviously better. I don't think there's any question about that. I think about how recently um, my family members couldn't vote almost within my lifetime. My parents voted for the first time 1 year before I was born. That's how recent this was. And so obviously those kinds of things are not issues to that degree, although I do have some concerns about um, laws that make it more difficult for people to vote. Like in Harris County in Texas, and Harris County is where Houston is. In the last election, the county, which has between 5 and 7 million people, had one drop in ballot box for the entire county. It's about 1,000 square miles. That was a deterrent for people to vote, and I think it was an intentional one. Um, it's impossible to say whether or not that was racially motivated, but it certainly had racial overtones or undertones. And so I think again, clearly, without question, the laws are different and better. But I think on a personal level, relationship level, societal level, sometimes some things are not better from what I'm seeing race relations. Unfortunately, I see too many people who are much more willing to let their inner thoughts out, whether that's audibly or typing them on online, and things that they would have kept to themselves or to really close inner circle people. They not only feel comfortable sharing those, but they feel comfortable bragging about it. They engage in, again, I've used the word vile already once, but I'm going to use it again because I've been targeted several times, and it's not fun, and it's shocking every time I see it. And again, I want to be, I don't want to be shocked for shock's sake, but I want shock to always be my initial reaction because I don't ever want to get used to it. I don't ever want to see something and say, oh, there it is again. I want to be surprised because I want to believe the best about people to whatever degree I'm able to, and whatever degree is reasonable and logical and realistic. So for this question, it's difficult for me because I without getting too personal, I've seen some things that I wish I hadn't seen and heard some things I wish I hadn't heard. So on the one hand, it seems like things are worse, but I still want to be optimistic and believe those are things and people who always believe that and they just feel more comfortable being public about it. So I'm not going to say that things are worse overall. At least that's the hope I'm going to hold on to for the time being. So I'm opening the floor for conversation here.
Well, it's a great question, and I concur with you. It's no pun intended. It's not exactly a black and white question or answer. Um, I think it really depends on where you are and where you're interacting. Uh, in the world that I live in and work in, the focus is on the kingdom of God. The kingdom of God, regardless of how it's been misconstrued and perverted and hijacked by Christian nationalists, it's not a an American political entity. It's not a matter of taking over the government. It's a work of the heart. And scripture says that the kingdom of God is righteousness, peace, and joy in the Holy Spirit. And so I find that in the kingdom of God, um, where every tribe, tongue, and nation is welcomed because we're all part of God's creation and we're all precious to Him. I find that the more we move toward that, uh, racial relationships or ethnic relationships, that fades away. Um, it changes your perspective on how to interact with someone who may look differently than you or come from a different culture or background than you. Um, and then I find the further people move away from that, the more they focus on the external differences. And so there's a real dichotomy there. We're living in a world that seems to be falling apart, and yet at the same exact time, um, things among people of the kingdom, and by the way, everyone is invited, uh, are growing closer together and strengthening relationships. Forgive me for preaching, but that is to me And I know other people have other answers, but for me, that is the answer. And I grew up in a home with a father who had been a Southern Baptist pastor, and in 1964 in Alabama, uh, a significant time in civil rights history, my father had his own personal spiritual revival. And part of that spiritual revival led him into a whole new perspective on relationships with people who were from different backgrounds. I guess today, the church that we were in, that he led, would have been called woke or progressive, which is ironic because at one time my father was part of the John Birch Society. And it was the spiritual renewal that led him out of the John Birch Society and out of that mindset. And so that's how I was raised. I was raised in a home where we ate with people from all backgrounds and had them as guests in our home, staying in our home, despite the objections of neighbors. Later, we had crosses actually burned in our yard.
Wow.
And so I was raised in that dynamic, and I was honored to be raised in that dynamic. And that was something that I aspired to as I got older, is to be that kind of a person who in their seeking of God would be transformed in their hearts and minds to become more open to people of different ethnicities, different backgrounds. And I'm still a work in progress at age 60.
So, Rob, what about you?
This is one of the hardest questions of all, I think. And I'm not real sure of the answer to it. I've grown up in an area where things in many ways are definitely better. They're different. Here in our area, one of the worst, most brutal, horrific lynchings that ever took place in the United States of America took place right here. You can look it up online. Mary Turner, a pregnant woman who was lynched. Her baby was cut from her belly, stomped to death in the mud. I mean, it's awful. I could take you to the spot where that happened. I know personally, and the gentleman is dead now, so I can say it. I know personally of a man who lived here in the 1950s who was in a car wreck with a black man. We're talking about a negligence issue. Allegedly the black man was at fault. I don't know who caused the car wreck, but this white man shot and killed the black man that caused the car wreck for causing the car wreck, and there were no consequences. This is something I knew personally of. Crosses burning. We were at a high school football game in 1989, and there was a group that burned a cross in full view of 10,000 people right out behind the football stadium. So I've seen that. Things seem, compared to that horrific history, things seem a lot better these days. I mean, our country is a lot more racially diverse than just black and white. Here in our area, when we talk about race, it's mainly still black and white. People go about town. We have black elected officials. In the workers' comp arena, I deal with black judges, black attorneys all the time, every week. We seem to have made a lot of progress in private. I wonder sometimes if folks think, well, what do white people talk about when they get together in private? Well, I could say growing up, I heard a lot more racial tests and things like that. Even at the family reunion or whatever, you don't hear that kind of stuff as much these days. There seems to be more acceptance. So I think things are better. And yet, over this past decade in particular, it seems like there's this current pulling the other direction. And, you do run across people that say things that, and really it started even before Trump. It really started with Obama. And some of the things I would hear people say that weren't just about being against President Obama for something he might have done, but they were really racially charged, and even things directed towards his wife. And so I think it really started then. But there definitely seems to be, like, we teeter on the edge of, are we going to continue to make progress, or will we be pulled backward? I mean, I know that what I believe, I don't remember if it's you, Melvin, or a friend of mine on Twitter, it may have been you, made a comment recently that we're all related if you go back far enough. And I believe that to the bottom of my soul, that God created us all the same. We're all kinfolks. So, I hope that we're moving forward. I don't know. It worries me. It worries me quite a bit.
Rob makes a great point that so much progress was made and there was so much optimism. And then in the past decade, or maybe a little more, there has been this other current that's become more and more vocal. And there's probably a lot of reasons why the most angry voices or the most extreme voices seem to have found a way to monetize their hatred. There is economic incentive now for saying the rudest and crudest and most hateful things. You can make a living doing that. And so some people have chosen to do that. And other people who listen to that, they sort of get sucked into this echo chamber, and it gets more and more extreme. And so now you have people, I hesitate to say his name, so I just won't. But he's a Nazi, okay? He's a vile, anti-Semitic, anti-black Nazi who has quite a following now among extremists in the Republican Party. Even some Republican Party officials and elected officials have met with this guy, had dinner with this guy in their home. But that would have been unimaginable to me.
That would have been disqualifying in the
100%.
80s.
100%. There would have been no question about it. And yet it goes on. Yesterday, I called out an individual who seems to be a self-appointed pastor in Louisiana for making the most sickening racial comments toward one of our Supreme Court justices. And
I saw that. Yeah.
Using the most extraordinarily vile language. And I had a lot to say about that, and others have as well. I think there used to be something of shame in our culture about saying and doing vile things. It's not that people didn't do those things, but they were ashamed of it, and other people would shame them. It seems like some folks have lost their ability to be ashamed of their bad actions and words. In fact, they revel in it and they make money from it. And as long as there's that incentive, as long as there's a market for that, there are politicians who will pander to that and advance some really retrograde proposals and laws that do increasingly disenfranchise people of color. And so it's a negative trend.
One thing Stephen mentioned, anti-Semitism. one of the most shocking things to me the past few years, and a few years ago, a good friend of mine who's a Jewish lawyer mentioned to me in a conversation, you're going to start to see more anti-Semitism in this country. And at the time, I thought, I've never really seen that or even heard of that, except in history books. But over the last 2 or 3 years in particular, it is absolutely everywhere now. And this is, you'll see people make comments about Jews running the world or Jews pulling the strings, all this kind of stuff. And it's, it seems to be exploding, at least online.
Yeah, absolutely. And Stephen, I know you didn't want to mention the person's name, but I don't mind mentioning it because I'm pretty sure you're talking about Nick Fuentes. And
Yes, I am.
I have a policy that I think it's important to name people, name things, because that way we're more aware of it. I realize there's a risk that somebody might be curious and then go and listen to him and see what's going on. That's not my responsibility. My intention is for somebody who may accidentally run across him, not know his background, and look for commonality with him. I want you to go into it knowing what he's about, and he's everything you
Yes.
said and more. He
Yes.
is not a person of goodwill. We'll put that sticker on him right now.
No, he isn't. And Nick Fuentes is exactly who I was referencing. And we know that there are politicians who have met with him, including Donald Trump.
Yeah, here in Texas, some very high-ranking officials have gone to fundraisers,
right.
PAC fundraisers with him.
That's right.
All right, so let's go ahead.
You know, as Rob said a few years ago, that would have been automatically disqualifying, and you said that's unthinkable. And yet now, what was unthinkable is not only thinkable; it's happening. So it's very concerning
It's
to me.
provocative now.
And the thing that breaks my heart is that there's Christians or people calling themselves Christians who engage in that. And I think it's important, you know, in my sphere, I have to call that out. I have to call that out. And what I have to say may not be popular or appreciated, and I don't care. You know, there is a time when you have to speak and say, this is not acceptable. This is not moral. This is not Christ-like, and I won't participate in it or endorse it.
All right, so that's a good point to jump into my next topic. I had this a few more questions down, but let's make this relevant and timely here. Do you think churches are a victim of a culture war, or are they creating one?
Do you want to take this one, Rob?
Well,
I'll start if you don't mind.
Well, let's start, Melvin. What do you think?
Yeah, you look like you were squirming a little bit. I'll take the heat off you. I think there's a little bit of both. And some things I have seen are what Christianese, as we call it, having grown up in the church, the world, people outside of Christianity, outside of churches, outside of our inner circle, see some of the things that we are supporting. They refuse to hear it, or they don't hear us denouncing things that are obviously not like what Jesus called us to be. And the word that one of my least favorite words in the whole English lexicon is hypocrite. But sometimes it fits. And I think this is one of those situations where it definitely fits. And I see people's responses to that as saying, well, if you don't believe what you say, why should I believe what you say? And so I think it's a response to that. On the other hand, there has been more of an aggressive effort by some, especially on the far left, to who are anti-Christian because of social issues. Again, some of it's warranted, not all of it is. And so I think, much like the question I had about racial progress, it can go both ways. And I've seen a lot of it. And I think we need to be a little bit more aware of our side's um, contribution to a culture war that I personally don't think we should be engaged in.
Well, remember the war on Christmas? That
Starbucks.
comes, yeah, yeah.
Like
Let's get really excited. Uh, I really wish if I can plug a couple of books. One is The Cost of Discipleship by Dietrich Bonhoeffer.
One of my heroes.
And another is The Insanity of God by Nick Ripken. And we could name many, many others. But I think it would be great. Another one is The Heavenly Man by Brother Yoon. It would really be important for American Christians to better understand and study what Christians in other nations go through every day. Talk with someone who's a follower of Jesus Christ who lives in Iran about what persecution is, or in communist China, or in Russia. And you'll discover that it's really intense. It's often deadly. It's heartbreaking. And we could learn a lot from them. One thing we would learn is how to be grateful for where we live and be thankful for religious liberty in this country. Believers, by and large, Christian believers, are not persecuted in this country. We may have someone say something negative about us. There are, as you said, Melvin, some extremists who pass laws or try to enact laws that really do infringe on religious liberty. But if I go to Target and an employee fails to say Merry Christmas to me and says instead Happy Holidays, I'm not being persecuted. Okay. Jesus Christ has not been blasphemed. So I think, however, there is a monetary value for people stirring up these issues and getting people all enraged and all excited and what is the outrage du jour. And so as long as pundits can make money, or preachers, by ranting and raving about the culture war and how we're persecuted, people who are not Christians look at that and it discredits us. And as I've said and others have said, when I speak with people who are atheists or people who used to be Christians, their comment is, we're not angry at Christians because you're too much like Jesus. We're angry because you're nothing like Jesus. And that's a real problem. I can't fix all that ails the world or correct or change what someone of a different religion or no religion at all might say or do. I have to address myself in my own heart. And I, as a pastor, I believe have a call to say to people in my circle, hey, we've got to do better. I don't know if that answers the question or not.
No, sure.
There you
go. Melvin, I've got my wife and I have an interesting relationship with the church these days, and so it's a hard question to answer. I think there is among the people in the pews, the common everyday churchgoer, they don't really want to hate any. You'll see comments where they hate everybody, but they really don't. they're trying to follow and live by what they think is biblical principle, but a lot of them are caught up in a very fear-based type of uh, religion and politics all mixed together in this cocktail. Stephen mentioned it. People that keep them stirred up. I think you said the outrage that you were, Stephen. It's I'll hear from these people. They'll be friends of mine, and they'll be churchgoers, and they'll send me some. I'm just having a normal day. I mean, things are good. Nobody's bothering me. Nobody's persecuting me. No, nothing's happening. And they'll send me something, some news story from usually some sort of extreme source. And they're like, how could this be happening in our country? And I'm like, this is not what we're supposed to be focused on. We're a country of 330 million people. You could go around every day and find something to be upset about. And so I was listening to another podcast this week called the Goodwill podcast.
You listen to
another. But it's a great podcast called the Goodwill podcast. But they were talking about Christians, how we should approach politics. And they made a mention of something. Too often we're focused on the what of politics, like an issue, a position, the cultural war issues. I said, but really, what about focusing on the how of politics? How we relate with our fellow citizens, how we interact with other people. Getting back to the beginning of this podcast, how do we have discussions with people with whom we disagree about politics? And, if you look at the things Jesus talked about, say in the Sermon on the Mount, it's not about your position on LGBTQ. It's about how do you treat other people? And can we get back to that in the church? Less fear-based, less cultural war, less politics is going to save us, and more about being people who go out and we treat others the way Jesus would treat them, and we show the love of Jesus. Can we get that back? Because I feel like we're really letting people are they're victims in a lot of ways, and I don't want to say that they're not responsible for their actions, because they are. But this sort of propaganda machine that's out there is powerful, and a lot of people just don't have the educational background, the sort of maybe scriptural background or whatever to be able to resist that, and they do sort of fall victim to it in a way. And so, how can we break that cycle?
Rob, I appreciate that you mentioned the Sermon on the Mount. I wish more Christians would spend more time reading the Sermon on the Mount than being indoctrinated by talk radio and cable news. Because I think that would help us a lot to be able to focus on what really matters, to make the top priority, and deal with people. I think a lot of times Christians think the most important truth in the world is all have sinned and come short of the glory of God. Well, that's true, and it's important. But there is a greater truth and a higher priority, and that is that God created us all in his image, and to be able to see the image of God in one another. And like you said, Rob, to respond to people the way that Jesus would respond to people. The simplicity of the question, what would Jesus do? How would Jesus interact with this person? And again, man, I fall short of that every day. But that's the compass that keeps pulling me back toward the right direction.
All right, that's a good segue to my next question, and it's a little bit of a long one, so just ask for your patience here, and don't be alarmed when I get to the question part of it. There's a little bit of a dialogue or monologue that goes along with it. So from what I can see, my perspective, there's an elephant in the room of American Christianity, and that's the rise of Christian nationalism and the overwhelming support for Donald Trump by white evangelicals. But to be fair, to, Vladimir Putin recently murdered Prigozhin and Navalny, a couple of his outspoken critics, and he won re-election by 87% of the vote. So it's not just an American thing. But from you two are white evangelicals, but I don't expect you to represent all of that subgroup. However, I do want you to tell me a couple of stories that you've experienced among your peers and family related to something that might be identified as Christian nationalism or white evangelicals supporting Donald Trump.
That's a very personal question. And to answer that is a real challenge, maybe even dangerous. In my world, and when I say my world, you mentioned the evangelical world, and specifically the white evangelical world. Right now, I know personally of quite a few friends of mine in ministry who either are, I don't want to say afraid, but they're very nervous about calling out any of the excesses of Donald Trump, because the vast majority of people in their congregation are very, very avid supporters of Donald Trump, or even referencing not just the personality, but referencing the bad behaviors. They're nervous to say anything, and when some have, it has cost them their job, or they've had a big split in the church, and that's a legitimate concern for a pastor. Now, to me, it reflects a failure of us as leaders in white evangelical circles. It reflects a failure of discipleship. And we, again, have seen more people discipled by far right-wing talk radio and cable news than by the teaching of Jesus. So there is a risk. I've personally had quite a bit of blowback, not from my family, but from people that I consider family and longtime friends, some of whom have chosen to end their relationships with me. Some of whom won't say it, but they won't say it to me, but they've ceased inviting me to come speak or interact in their churches. I've had some pretty ugly online conversations with people who consider me a traitor. I've been called a traitor. I'm not sure what they thought I was betraying or what I was loyal to. But apparently I wasn't pro-Trump enough. So, you count the cost. For me, those are painful. But again, if I have someone in, say, Iran as a model for me, I can't complain. I have no right to complain. That is minor stuff compared to what Christian brothers and sisters around the world are dealing with every day.
It's a difficult question, Melvin. I mean, like Stephen said, it's very personal because some of the stuff that my wife and I have had said to us, and things over the last few years have been Um, it's it's hard to get past. I mean, you don't want to dwell on it. You don't want to dwell on the negative. You want to keep moving forward. Um, but when you have people that you've loved and respected, and they say things like, "Well, you must not really be a Christian if you're not voting for Trump," or "Well, have you become a socialist?" Which is bizarre because I mean, hey, I'm a business owner. I make a profit. How can I be a socialist? But anyway, um, it's things that it gets very personal. I mean, down to this extent. Uh, the next Sunday is Easter. My parents who are older, uh, they invited us to go to their church with them on Easter, and I'd like to go. But the last time we were in their church, their pastor praised Trump from the pulpit, and he probably won't do that on Easter. He doesn't do that every Sunday. I bet it makes you like, hey, I don't know. Do I even want to go to church with my own parents because that's what we heard the last time we were there? And so it's all been a very, I mean, you can't get around that a vast majority of white Southern evangelicals have are 100% in on Donald Trump, and it makes it difficult. And then people treat you like sometimes, well, Stephen said it, like you're a trainee, like you've there's this concept in the South that you got to be loyal to the family. You got to be loyal to the tribe. You got to be loyal to the community. And they almost treat you like, you've turned your back on all of that, and you've turned your back on us. And they don't understand why. And I don't feel like I've turned my back on anybody. I feel like I'm the same person I've always been, just trying to live out the same values I've always had. But that's the way it's seen. So it stinks. I mean, I don't know. Lie to you, it stinks sometimes.
You just
It
said something
does.
that really sparked something in my brain. You said turned your back on us, and I think that comes down to I've talked about this before, and I've even written about it: the us versus them mentality. And if you're not part of us, you're part of them, and them isn't just an opposition group or an individual; it's an enemy. It becomes extreme. And again, the war terminology.
Oh yeah.
You're either on this side or you're on that side, and if you're on that side, we're at war with you. It's it's extreme and it's dangerous.
Yes, absolutely. And when you mix the religious and the political to the extent that we have these days, not only does it become a war analogy, but now it becomes a spiritual war analogy. So not only if you're not on our side, then guess whose side you must be on? You're on
Yeah.
Satan's side. I mean, people will tell you that,
Yeah.
and they believe it.
Yeah. The absolute extreme language, and that's being fostered and encouraged in churches by people like, since we're naming names, Charlie Kirk. Churches are platforming uh, this guy and taking some kind of scriptural lessons from a guy who is wholly unqualified to give any kind of lesson from scripture, who I consider a vile, dishonest individual, um, someone who's divisive and anti-kingdom of God. But he comes into churches now, is platformed by churches and ministries to spread the message, not of Jesus Christ, but of Christian nationalism and seizing power and demonizing opponents, demonizing people of other ethnicities. I believe he's a racist. And yet, churches bring him in to indoctrinate the people in the church. That sickens me. And some churches that I have personally been in and know, it's tragic to me. I know I'm recommending a lot of books, but I do want to recommend on this particular subject Tim Alberta's book, The Kingdom, the Power, and the Glory, and also Losing Our Religion by Dr. Russell Moore. Those books have been tremendously helpful to me. I deeply, deeply appreciate David French and the articles that he writes from a place of love as a follower of Jesus, but also a place of prophetically calling out what I consider to be really a heresy of Christian nationalism. And like Rob said, this isn't just an abstract thing. This is something that comes into our world, into our relationships, our friendships, our families. I have heard from so many people who are brokenhearted because their families have been splintered by this wicked ideology, and relationships shattered. That's ungodly to me.
It's tragic. It's really a tragedy. So we've talked a lot about some downer topics today, much more than I usually do. So I want to end on something positive, at least the potential for positivity. So I've only got a couple of questions left. We're way over where I normally go, but I think people will understand that with two guests, we've got a lot more opinions and a lot more discussion, and I hope they're still listening. This is something that is thoroughly important. It's thoroughly worthwhile to delve into, even if it makes us feel a little bit uncomfortable. I think that gets us to a place that's much closer to having some conversations that are productive and fruitful. So with that in mind, how can we focus on positive gains and commonalities? Either one of you, whoever wants to go first.
I'll go first. So, well, you know, I try to be an optimist, Mel. And my first introduction to politics as a young teenager was Ronald Reagan. And as years have gone on, people have reassessed Reagan's legacy, et cetera. But the one thing I think that you still see when you go back and listen to Reagan's speeches is an optimism about the future of America. America as the shining city on the hill. America as the place that the world can look to for inspiration. And so I think it is very important to, despite the all the bad of the past few years, to focus on the positives, focus on moving forward. One thing that I think helps is a historical perspective. It feels like these are difficult times. You know, when people talk about living through historical times, we've been living through historical times with Trump, with the pandemic, with other issues. Now we've got various wars in different places of the world, Israel, Gaza, Ukraine, Russia. These are difficult times. But our country's been through very difficult times before. We've been through the Vietnam War, civil rights era, strife, protest, assassinations that took place in that era. We've obviously been through World War II, the Great Depression. We've been through the Civil War, which of course is way before any of our lifetimes, but for 5 years, the country was in, literally killing each other. And so I think when we see that we've come through these things in the past, there's no reason to think that we can't come through what we're dealing with now. And to look at the good part of America, we are 330 million people who come here from all over the world. There's people that have been here since the Mayflower. There's people that have just came last week. But, to be an American, it isn't about how long you've been here or what your background is. It's about, do you support the principles of this country? Democracy, liberty, equality. Do you believe in those things? Opportunity. And anybody can come here from anywhere in the world and be an American. You can't, not anybody can go and become a Russian. Okay? You got to be born a Russian. Not anybody can go, but anybody can come and become an American. And I just think that the country can be what the world looks up to as an example. Not that we're perfect or ever will be, but as an example of how people can live together and pursue freedom and democracy and opportunity together. And I don't think we've lost that ability. It's kind of shaken, but I think we can get it back, Johnny Cash always sing about the ragged old flag. Well, it's kind of ragged, but it's still there. And I try to stay an optimist. Our best days are ahead of us, and I hope that our children and our grandchildren will see those days come.
I can't top Johnny Cash, but I love the reference. I think one of the calls in my ministry is to see more reconciliation between generations and restoring the generational bridge. Recently, I lost my father. He was almost 87 years old. But there was such a value in being able to talk to him about the things he had lived through. Rob, you mentioned the Depression and World War II and all of those things. Well, he lived through that and he had personal experience. I'm so grateful. Before he passed, just a couple of years ago, I arranged an interview between my father and my niece, who at the time was maybe 14. So we have granddaughter and grandfather sitting down, and it was at the height of the pandemic, and she was not able to go to school, and there were a lot of things happening that were baffling to her. And I thought there would be a benefit in having a conversation between granddaughter and grandfather, where she could ask him questions about his experiences and how did he get through them. And so we set up a couple of videos, and she did a great job interviewing him. She came up with all the questions, and they had a really warm dialogue together. It was very comforting. And I just think anything we can do to facilitate or participate in those kind of conversations, to encourage younger people that we can get through this, that we serve a faithful and gracious God, and that there have been many times in our past that were even more difficult than today. We don't know what's ahead, but we do know that we serve a God who is faithful, and we know that there have been heroes who have arisen in the past, unlikely heroes. Nobody sets out to become a hero. And sometimes you're a hero by just making it day by day and helping your neighbor. And that's, I think, where the hope is for the future. We can find common ground. We all have things that we share in common. And one of the best ways to discover that is to try to help someone who's going through, they're having a hard day, or maybe they've lost their job or lost their home. Maybe they don't have anything to eat. Maybe they just need a hug, or they need someone to give them a word of encouragement. And that's a way to bond with one another's hearts. And there's things that divide us. There's things we're going to disagree on. But again, if we can see the humanity in each other and care for one another, that's the way forward, I believe.
Well, that seems like the perfect way to wind this down. That's a good word there from Pastor Steve. So our guests today have been Pastor Stephen Simpson from Alabama and attorney Rob Ryan from Georgia. Gentlemen, first, I want to let you know I appreciate your friendship. And then second, I appreciate your willingness to discuss these topics openly and honestly. So thank you for being here today.
Thank you, Melvin. Thank you, Ron.
I've enjoyed it.
Thanks. That's it for this week's episode of Stories from Real Life. Join us again next time for another great storytelling journey. Until then, don't forget to shine your light wherever you go.